Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So engagers, today we have Richard Landers. Richard, before we make your intro, can you tell us if you are prepared to engage?
Sure. I'm always up for it.
Let's do this, because Richard Landers is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Minnesota and holds the John P. Campbell Distinguished Professorship of Industrial Organization Psychology. His research concerns the use of innovative technologies in psychometric assessment, employee selection, adult learning, and research methods with a recent focus on game-based assessment, gamification, artificial intelligence, unproctored and mobile internet-based testing, virtual reality, and social media. His work has been published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Computers and Human Behavior, and Psychological Methods, among others, and his work has been featured in popular outlets such as Forbes, Business Insider, and Popular Science. So many exciting things going around with Professor Richard Landers. So is there anything that we missed from that intro?
That's more than enough.
That's great, Richard. So before we get started into deep content questions, we want to, because we were discussing before starting about how crazy this day has been and the week in general has been going on. So we want to know, in general, how does a day in the life of Richard Landers look like?
Well, I think what attracted me to the professorial lifestyle is that every day is really dramatically different. So, in some cases, it's me sitting in my home office writing, and in other days, it's like today, waking up early in the morning, celebrating our PhD graduates, and running between. I did some makeup exams earlier today. It's been just sort of a wild ride every day. The fun thing I've been doing recently is spending a lot of time setting up a virtual reality lab. That's been a lot of time, but a lot of fun. So yeah, just every day, whatever needs to get done.
Sounds like pretty exciting, so I can't complain about that. So Richard, we are going to go right into the first question that we always like to make, and it's a question that might sound a bit difficult sometimes because it's about failure or the first attempt in learning. Because you listen to the intro and you say, well, he's got it all figured out, everything goes well, but we know even though we can have great successes and do great things, that also comes up from having spectacular and interesting failures to learn from. So Richard, is there an occasion that you could say is maybe your favorite fail or your first attempt in learning, something that you learned from that? How did you get out? Can you bring us to the ground level with that story?
Sure. So it's actually a story I use quite often to warn people. I think a lot about kind of fooling yourself in terms of kind of new technologies and new things that you're exposed to, being a little too forward thinking for your own good, which was actually probably about 2005, 2006. I as a researcher, you pick what research topics you want to really get into and what things you want to devote your time and energy toward. And I devoted a lot of energy to Second Life, which at the time was really being sort of sold as the next great wave of, how we interact with each other on the internet. Reuters opened up a news office in Second Life. There was, there was just a huge amount of enthusiasm for living in the metaverse. And it was almost sort of an early sort of gamification that we would, make our lives and our interactions with each other better by just moving into Second Life. And in hindsight, some people now don't even remember what Second Life was. Of course, it's where you create a virtual avatar of yourself, and you can interact in this big online, social world. And people don't use that. We're not in the metaverse right now, as it turns out. So my enthusiasm was entirely sort of tech-driven at that time. In a lot of the way that I think people now get really excited about gamification because games, and they don't go much further than that. I got excited about Second Life because I was just like, oh, the metaverse is the future, full stop. And that was, I think that was a defining moment for me. Really figuring out that, really exploring and understanding the true underlying value of new technologies, which now is translated into some of the things you listed: artificial intelligence, games, gamification, and so on. That became really kind of a defining moment for me. And I don't, I'm much more hesitant now. I think especially in the area of where we're putting a lot of effort now, game-based assessment. There's a lot of enthusiasm for just, changing hiring processes into games because they're games. Why wouldn't you do that? And I try to come at it from a perspective of a healthy, optimistic skepticism to say, I bet there are good uses, but I bet there's a lot of bad ones too, and I need to figure out why. So that's a big motivating factor for me, and I think it stems from that early failure.
You were into the early Ready Player One Second Life. Yeah, but I think it's a nice what I think it provided you, and it certainly has shaped some of the things that you do in the future for sure. Is giving you that perspective that the latest and greatest is not always the latest and greatest. Basically, some things may go the way it goes, and that's part of innovation, and some things just flap and flop, and that's it. And
absolutely. And it's easy to get carried away. I mean, you can get really excited. If anybody, I think, in the game space is likely to get excited about new interactive, fun experiences. So it's really easy to get swept up in that without really taking a step back and kind of critically evaluating. Why are we doing this in the first place? What exactly is the value, and can I really explain that? And some people have a really good intuition of it, and some people don't. I think it's healthier in the long run if we can really explain it more so than just have an intuition. It's weird kind of especially in the entertainment game space. Like, you see these game designers that are just almost virtuosos, like sort of naturals in figuring out exactly what engages people and what draws them into an experience. But the vast majority of people, I think, myself included, there's a little intuition, but a lot of it is, we need to sit back and critically evaluate this to figure out what really is the best option. And it's real easy to fall into a trap of thinking, that my intuition's enough. And I think that's dangerous.
Testing is always a friend.
Yeah. Not too much, but yes. You can overtest too.
That makes sense. So taking it like in a 180-degree spin, what would you say is something that you have solved, or something that you faced using, again, game-based assessments, game-based learning, gamification, any of these strategies that we've been talking about, and that you could say actually the first try, second try, third try, doesn't matter, but it actually ended up in the place you wanted it to arrive to?
Yeah, those early lessons, it really inspired kind of my current approach, and I think it's more successful now, which is, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, which is really just psychology applied to the workplace. So we do a lot of work on hiring and a lot of work on training design and performance appraisals and all these kind of traditional human resources processes, and they very much suffer from the same sort of shiny new object kind of fascination, that when something new comes out, that they really want to just throw a lot of energy and money into things that may or may not actually pan out. So what we've been doing lately is, for virtual reality, trying to figure out how can we create experiences that actually add value to organizations. Because it's one thing to just say, I'm going to throw an experience into VR, and I'm going to create kind of an interactive experience for somebody using some of these kind of game ideas, game design ideas. It's one thing to say that, and it's another to say, well, I did that and it had an outcome that I wanted. So, like right now, we actually know a lot about things like interviews. Like, how do you interview a person? How do you bring somebody through a hiring process in a way that they don't feel alienated by a company? And at the same time, we have other forces saying, oh, but we need to make hiring more exciting and more amazing and more engaging. So that's, there's a careful balance to strike there. And one of the things that we've done lately with VR is to try to figure out then, well, where is the right balance for that? It doesn't make sense, for example, really to do job interviews in VR. Like, why would you do that? We can already get a pretty good interaction from, video conferencing, for example. You can see people's facial expressions. You can get a really good sense of who they are. There are some downsides to that in relation to in-person interviewing, but at the same time, you get most of the way there. So to take that extra jump and say, oh, well, let's ship somebody a VR headset, what are you really gaining from that? So our success then is in figuring out where do you get the value from that? And what we've been doing lately is trying to figure out how people handle stress. So to say, well, right now, if you want to know, will this, potential employee handle stress well, there's not really any good way to figure that out. You basically just have to hire them and say, well, I hope it works out, and then watch. And if they don't do a good job, then they might get fired or not get promoted or whatever other sort of bad things might happen. But it's better for both of the people in that interaction. It's better for the employer who's taking a risk on hiring an employee, but also better for the employee who's going to have a really bad experience in a highly stressful job if we can try to identify that ahead of time. And VR provides kind of the immersive environment to really move you into the moment where you can get some really good information about how people handle stressful situations. So we are actually in the process right now of sort of creating essentially a work simulation. It's a sort of where you're placed in the role of being a manager and you're asked to give a performance appraisal to an underperforming employee. So it's a very high social interaction, high stress kind of thing. Where you're actually saying, I noticed from your log that there's some issues here in your previous performance, and I need to talk to you about them and develop a plan. And so we use VR as a way to kind of make that situation alive. To really say, you're really staring a person in the face, telling them they're doing a bad job. How do you handle that? Do you do the right things? Do you crumble under the pressure when the actor, the person that you're kind of role playing with, when they push back, when they say, I think you're being unfair to me, how do you handle it? And VR actually really engages a person at a deeper kind of level. Like you really feel like you're in there. And by using VR that way, you can you really take advantage of the medium in a way that's not possible in other approaches. So I've been really happy with how that research has been going here lately, because it really feels like we're getting something truly new, but at the same time we're finding value in it. It's not new for new's sake. We're actually able to do something that we couldn't do before. I think it's really important.
That sounds super exciting. When you were saying about the virtual interviews and what's the value that you could add with VR, and I was thinking, well, other than knowing if the person is just wearing underwear, nothing above his shirt, it's not much what you can do with a virtual interview, other than because of course you can see the person's expression, you can put them under relatively stressful situations, similar to what you can do in real life, sitting right across to them, so it wouldn't change much. But that seems like a very interesting way of approaching it through the VR. Because as you say, it's completely immersive. You're literally in there. You're watching the person's eyes and saying you're doing whatever wrong and pushing back, and so it sounds very, very exciting. I really think it's super, super, I don't know, engaging and useful, which is in the end, I think that the big issue that we sometimes face in these approaches is knowing what do we want to achieve with that. It's not just having something new, but having something new and what is it going to be for? Even beforehand. I mean, not we have it there and what do we do with it now? It's like, I want this, but what do I want it for? I can remember that at some point we were like struggling to find a project in which to use VR, exactly, because we're creating learning materials. And it was like, well, we're a business school, so what can we do with that? It was pretty difficult to find something, and we spent several years in which we were just thinking and nothing came up because we didn't just want to put them in I don't know, like you're in a marketing office and how do you do a marketing project? Like okay, yeah, cool, that's nice and it's nice to have, but it's not going to make a difference, as you were saying. It's not going to make a real impact. And that was and finding something like exciting like that one, I think it's absolutely perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about the capabilities, and the human-computer interaction researchers, they talk about it in terms of affordances. Like what are you able to do with this technology that you were unable to do before? And I think the natural tendency is just to assume that, if I use blank, then blank. If I do X, then Y will happen. But with new media, games included, that it's really more that you're creating the potential for interactions, the more the opportunity to engage with it in a particular way. So in the instructional context, my favorite use of VR is in recreating chemistry labs, because you can actually have a person physically in like a recreated lab, have beakers, test tubes, things around them, and you can have them engage with that environment in a very hands-on way that you can't otherwise do without it. Like you can kind of fake it using like a 2D game in a web browser, but you're not really getting that same level of, okay, I need to walk over here and grab this test tube, and after I put this in, there's like a 10-second delay before the next thing needs to happen, and you have to physically go and find the other. I mean, it really recreates the experience in a way that you can't get in other approaches. Whether that's valuable to you or not then depends on your goals. So if you care about students having that experience, then VR gives you an affordance you didn't have before that's valuable to you. If you don't care about them having an experience, and if you just want to have them memorize, A with B with C with D, then you don't get anything from that. So really matching your goals up with exactly what design processes you use and what specific technologies get involved. Like that's the key for me. And a lot of people just don't do that.
You'd be surprised. Yeah. Absolutely. So we've been talking about both success and failure, and I know you've been involved with quite a few projects. But do you, when you're facing one of these challenges, do you have some sort of process, some sort of steps that you follow when you're going to create such solutions?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've actually published a few pieces on how to gamify effectively. A little bit related to learning, and a little bit just more broadly. It's really sort of the way we presented it is sort of this reverse engineered process where you think about what is the kind of the ultimate outcome that you're after. So in businesses, that's usually some kind of return. It might be like retention of employees. It might be better job performance. It could be any number of things. But to take that and to say, well, what do I need to happen about what needs to change about people in order for this other thing to happen? So if you're targeting, for example, retention, a common one we deal with right now is retention in the application process. So when somebody applies for a job, there's a probability for every person that they're going to drop out before they get to the end. So people are often gamifying application processes now with a goal of getting people to stay engaged. So great, that's fine as a first step. But you have to ask yourself then, if your goal is retention of applicants during the application process, then what about that experience needs to change for that to happen? So is it just that they're uninterested? Is it that they don't see the value in what they're doing? Is it that they say, there's a legal utility trade-off where it's like, I'm being put through an awful lot and I don't like it? Is it because they have a poor impression of the company? They say, well, if the company's going to put me through this in order to apply, maybe that means my job will be terrible too. Like, what exactly is it that is leading people to leave? And then only at that point can you say, all right, well, if I'm going to gamify this process to improve it, what game elements are likely to change that aspect, that sort of psychological state that they're in a way that I like? So we really try to follow this kind of reverse engineering approach. Like, what is the ultimate goal? What psychological or behavioral change would really lead to that goal? And then what kind of game approach or game design elements would lead to that change we want? And it's only, I think it's really only through that process that you end up, or at least some variation on that process, that you end up really creating the change that you want. I talk to startups quite frequently, and they often are talking about, we want to gamify. I'm like, why do you want to gamify? And they say, because that people will buy gamify. Like, that's not a good reason. Like, you have to have you have to have some function you're trying to accomplish with the gamification, some reason game design would actually help change something about people. And if you don't have that, then it's just a waste of time and other resources. I think the reverse engineering approach is really our core, and I think it's just super important to making sure you actually get what you want out of these things.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's actually one of the things that we of course, with variations, everybody has specifics and non-specifics, but I think that's a common thread amongst the people that come here and talk about some sort of process they have, to start with what do you want to get to. And if you don't start there, to be honest, I don't know how you can be successful other than, serendipity or instinct, as you were saying. Some people are just virtuosos and, they just get there for some reason. But if you don't know where you're going, how can you get there?
Yeah, it's super frustrating. It happens in everything that's a craft. Like crafts are these kind of applications of scientific principles with a little dash of art in order to create some outcome you want. And so just like with making film, like there's some people that are just naturally they artistic and their intuition is completely in line with making an amazing, film or amazing game or whatever it might be. But you're relying so much on chance for that to happen that your average person trying to gamify or create a game, like most people don't have that intuition. Even people that play, like I've played tens of thousands of hours of video games, and even now I have to take a step back frequently in doing these things to say, well, wait a minute, what exactly is going on here? Does my intuition make sense? Or am I just kind of making things up as I go? And really getting down to we're never going to have a strict set of rules. We're never going to say to make a successful game do A, B, and C. But I think we can reasonably get to a point to successfully gamify, to successfully make a game, you need to at least do A and B, and then beyond that, there's some interpretation. So, part of the move I think in the entertainment games industry right now, like you can see that AAA game titles tend to have a lot of similar characteristics these days. They tend to engage in certain ways. They tend to give a lot of player flexibility, a lot of engagement in terms of what you're able to do, a lot of flexibility. And because there's a lot of evidence now that people having control over their game environment and really feeling that connection to when I do something with my controller, it really has an immediate impact on the screen, and that impact on the screen has a larger impact. Like that's useful. People find that satisfying, and so that becomes part of the science then of game development that you can base future gamification in games on. So we have to have that blend, I think, to say, what do we know people like, what works, and what can I then give to others in the future so that when they try to gamify, when they try to build games for certain purposes, that they're at least, I know they're starting on a solid footing. Maybe the implementation will still go off the rails later, but at least in the beginning, I'm like, here are some good solid principles to base this thing on. And without that, it's just, it becomes like, like writing a novel. Like it becomes all virality. Like, do you just happen to hit on that particular combination of things people want? That leads it to be popular. And in organizations and in education, I think it's too risky. Like you don't want to spend those kind of resources just for maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Like you need a firmer footing than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's at RobAlvarezB and the hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Richard, talking about the things that we think should be done right and those things that we know are working, would you say that there's something sort of a best practice, something that you would almost say that every gamification would at least benefit from implementing, using, strategizing through, or whatever that is?
It's definitely design. The tendency to just buy technology or lease or rent or whatever you might do, and then just stick it on something, I think is the simplicity of that is very attractive, but it's ultimately design practices that create the outcome that you want. So what drives me crazy in the gamification space are all these vendors that are selling like, oh, we'll take your website and add points. Like, okay, like why would you do that? Like there's no rationale behind what the points will accomplish. Like what are you trying to communicate to people? Why will they find that valuable? What will that ultimately do? And if anybody ever approached that with a design mindset to say, well, how do we create this in such a way that it leads to these outcomes we want? Whether you use the reverse engineering kind of approach that I described or not, as long as there's some kind of design process there, I think every project just has to have it. Actually, there's a good VR example from my field. One of the earliest research studies in virtual reality in IO psychology was on training. And what they did is they randomly assigned people to experience two versions of a training program. In one, they sat in a room and watched a training video on like a projector screen. In the other condition, they put on a VR headset and watched the same training video on a virtual projection screen. And there's no design effort there at all. It's just, oh, what if I just stick this thing over in this tech thing and see what happens? And that lack of attention to, well, how can I take advantage of this environment? What do I really get out of it? Like, that's the kiss of death for the value of that approach. Like, are you going to get the same thing out of a video in VR versus a video not in VR? Yeah, obviously. That's not even an interesting question. It's how can we take advantage of VR? How can we design the experience to really get what we want out of it? Like, that's where you're going to find the value. So in any gamification project, like, some attention paid, even if you're not good at it, like, some attention paid to designing and to saying, different people experience this differently. How do we pay attention to that? What are we going after? How are we going to implement different aspects of this project to get that thing we want? Like, just that kind of thinking and asking those questions, I think it has to be a part of any gamification project, at least if you want to get any sort of return out of it, any sort of value.
Absolutely. If you don't think about what you're doing, then why would you even do it? Why would you spend money, effort, time, whatever it is you're spending, which you certainly will? Why would you just do that? We had some vendor at some point come to us and say, "Oh, you just get this and you put it onto your learning system," and it's like, yeah, well, but you're adding some value. The question is, I still have to do the whole design, which is probably the most working part. So why would I even be interested in that? We have people of technology doing it inside. So, like, what value are you adding? And it's hard to justify. I know there are some fantastic vendors selling gamification and some people doing great work, but I think the best ones in general have exactly that design element that you were mentioning, which is having some sort of design or guiding people to be able to design whatever it is that they're going to use. So I completely agree. That was the long way of saying I agree.
Yeah, in education, one of the big fads, I think, a few years ago, and it's sort of puttering along now, was the badging and micro-credentialing kind of approach. That you can say, well, we don't want to, like, invest any resources in giving people greater value, but what we could do is we could award badges people can put on their resumes, and then somehow they'll magically think that's useful. So the lack of design in that process is immediately obvious, because there's often very little attention paid to, well, why would they do that? Like, that's fundamentally, that's all it is. Is all you're asking in any design process is, why would someone care about this thing you're doing? And even that fundamental, because it's not just thinking about what you're doing, it's thinking about why other people would care about what you're doing. And that kind of act of empathy, of being to recognize that you have to take a step back and try to think about how other people would perceive what you're doing, how other people would perceive the system you're creating, and how they would use it and why they would use it that way. That it's just so often missing. There was an honest discussion I was a part of when talking about badging and micro-credentialing. They were saying, well, students are taking in our program 2 or 3 English classes consistently. So if they're doing that, why don't we just create a badge that says, like, they can write now, like a writing badge, and they can put that on their resume? Like, it's every student. Like, if every student has to do that and every student gets a badge, why would anyone want a badge? It doesn't mean anything. And just thinking through, like, those implications, it's very hard. But yeah, it's something, like, I think a lot of the very successful gamification people now, gamification companies, are actually hiring, like, humanities folks, people trained in kind of the traditional liberal arts, who have an English education or an art education, because those degrees are very much focused on the humanity of the experience. Like, how do people experience the world around them? How do they experience the text they're reading? How do they experience the things they're looking at? And having that kind of mindset I think is incredibly valuable for successful gamification. When you approach it as a completely technical exercise, when it's just, I have a point system, I will add point system to this thing I have, like, you lose all of the motivational potential of it. So being able to integrate and being able to step back and empathize with the user, and not just in the we do A/B testing sense, but to really think through exactly what motivations people have with the systems they're interacting with, and being able to make good choices, informed choices as to how to create them given that. Like, that's, I don't know, it's just so critical and often very underappreciated.
Definitely. And talking about underappreciation, sometimes some games are not very well appreciated. Is there a game that you would like to name as your favorite game?
Ooh, favorite is hard.
Thousands of hours upon thousands of hours.
Well, I mean, the game I've spent the most time with is Kerbal Space Program, and I think that's probably, I think I've probably put 500 plus hours into that at this point, which is, essentially it's an indie game. I think it might have been purchased by Microsoft. That doesn't sound right. Yeah, it was an indie game though. You get to simulate being NASA. It was one of my first early exposures to like the real potential, I think, of serious games or games for learning. This idea that you can take something as enormously complicated as literally rocket design, rocket science, and orbital mechanics, and put that into a fun format that helps people learn, but again, is also actually fun. So, I created space stations and launched interplanetary missions and learned more about physics than I did probably in all of college from playing that game. So it really, I think it's starting to be a little bit more forgotten. It got a lot of press for a few years, but it's still going strong, and they're still modifying it and still adding stuff to it, and it's a really incredible experience. You said underappreciated. The game I've been spending the most time with lately is underappreciated only because VR is still underappreciated, which is Beat Saber, which rhythm game, which is lightsaber type Guitar Hero, like Guitar Hero, but you're like hitting blocks with lightsabers. So it's I don't know if it's underappreciated exactly. It's probably the most popular. It's close to like a system seller as we're going to get for VR, at least for the time being. But yeah, both amazing experiences, but in very different ways.
Absolutely. And Richard, after listening to these questions, getting at least a general vibe of what the podcast is about, is there anybody that comes to your mind that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one?
Yeah, I was looking through your archive, and the person I was going to suggest you've already interviewed. I was thinking about this further, I think Ioannis Nikolaou, I don't think you've interviewed him, is kind of in this space also, doing some really innovative work related to games and gamification. And I'm going to be very selfish, kind of from this IO psychology perspective specifically. Yeah, we're hosting this the U.S. National Science Foundation, big grant, government grant agency, has granted us a workshop to bring together all the game-based assessment people. So that's been really on my mind lately. And there's a lot of really cool game-based assessment folks that are doing some really innovative work. Ioannis is one of those. Actually, I don't think you probably haven't interviewed Valerie Shute. Was it?
Nope.
Yeah, Florida State. She was one of the first ones to really think about the idea of how do we get interesting, useful information out of games. So she actually repurposed Plants vs. Zombies in order to assess children's problem-solving ability, because it's a common problem when you have kind of K-12, early education kids. They don't want to sit down and take tests. So the ability to get information about a child's ability in a way that's non-threatening, not anxiety-producing, but you still get a really good sense of how well they're developing. It's a really cool kind of goal. And so, she created this idea of stealth assessment, where kids are being assessed by playing video games. They don't even realize they're being assessed. And it's just a really powerful kind of approach, I think. And her writing also some really good intuitions about kind of kids and how they interact with games and such. So yeah, I think those would be my recommendations.
Super exciting. It sounds like very interesting topics. And in the same sense of recommendations, do you have any books that you would recommend to the audience, to the engagers?
That's a great question. It depends on exactly what perspective you're coming from. I'd say I still, even now, refer back to the old classics, so to speak, of game design and play, like the Salen Zimmerman, the Rules of Play book, is probably one that I still every once in a while I'm go back to, just kind of refresh myself on the basics. And it's a lot. I mean, really, I think design is a very difficult thing to do, and there's so many dimensions to it that, just if you haven't read it lately, or haven't read it for that matter, I think it's a really valuable one. In my space, I found a lot of value lately in looking at books on. There's one, Storytelling with Data. I can't remember the author now, but it's really about how it's almost gamifying data presentation. Like if you're running statistical analyses, how do you communicate that? and how do you do it in an effective way. There's been a big movement in IO psychology lately and in HR to start doing these like virtual dashboards where you can get all sorts of information about your employees. And in general, people are really bad at it because they don't. It's the same sort of reasons they don't go through those engagement sort of processes. So there's design processes that you should really go through. So if you have an interest in that, yeah, that book I found really useful also. So yeah.
I also teach a bit of quantitative methods at the business school, so that makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. What would you say, Richard, is your sweet spot? That thing that you feel is like your superpower in gamification?
Oof. Yeah. So I feel like being a translator is probably my strength. Right, like right now, IO psychologists. So I work with a lot of HR people. I work with organizational designers. Work with organizational development practitioners, like people that take a very hardcore business mindset, very practical. And it's they often see this idea of gamification and they're like, oh, people spend a lot of money on games, so we should get a piece of that. And that's about as far as they go in some cases. So being able to say, the ability to translate, to say, here's all this really cool work going on in human-computer interaction. Here's all this really cool work going on in game design and game studies. Really understanding how people engage with the environments that they see in front of them, and being able then to craft experiences for other people using that knowledge. Yeah, I think that translation element is probably my strength, I guess, because it's not always obvious, especially IO psychologists are trained as scientists, so it's very much the mindset of come in with a useful hypothesis. Test it. If it works out, go forward. If it doesn't, stop. And I find myself often in the role of saying, well, just because you found that your gamification didn't work doesn't mean gamification doesn't work, because gamification is really a design process. It's a way of recrafting experiences for people. In ways that are aligned with, kind of your goals, whatever they might be. So just because it didn't work this time doesn't mean it couldn't be refined. Just because you didn't get the outcomes you want doesn't mean those outcomes aren't possible. So being able to translate that kind of mindset, that design mindset, into kind of your bread and butter organizational functioning, which is so by the books. I think that's probably. That's probably where I would put myself. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's super useful as well. I would say that, that the element of translation is always necessary when you have people in teams in general, because you always have people who are take things from one side or the other, and that makes sense. That's the way to get things to work. And in gamification, you're getting these people to understand what the value that can be provided is, and that's I'm not guessing. I'm sure that's super super useful, and that you've been able to achieve quite a few things thanks to that, and to get people's perspectives and expert perspectives on things that they probably didn't even know they had, and then you put it forward.
Yeah. Game design is such a weird place because people assume it's easy. I don't know why. It's just by default, like, oh, somebody was just emailing me asking about, do you want to do a master's thesis on involving like leadership in games? He's like, oh, so I figured, we would just go work with somebody and get a game design so we could test it. I'm like, you're missing some details there, and there's a lot more steps than you think there are to get to that point. So being able to translate between the areas, just a vitally, not just me, it's a vitally important skill to be open enough to ideas, to be willing to integrate between different perspectives, people with fundamentally different understandings of what's important and how you evaluate what's important. It's not even the actual target. It's being able to say, a person trained as a scientist will value this. A person trained as an engineer will value this. A person in humanities will value this. And being able to take a little bit from all of those perspectives and blend them into a shared understanding. It's so important on those teams. One of the most dysfunctional environments that I've ever been in. I don't want to go back to more failures, but one of the most dysfunctional kind of environments in IO is when you have distinct teams. When there is like an IO psychologist subject matter expert team, and then there's a game design team, and they just like meet and chat with one another like once a month to like sort of communicate. It's just like that's not an interdisciplinary integrative approach to the problem, and making games useful is going to require a lot of different perspectives at the same time. And when those teams just kind of like, oh, what have you been doing, and then all right, break, let's not talk to each other for a few weeks, like that's not going to work. Like you have to be in constant communication and translating for each other all the time. And whether that takes somebody from the outside or whether the people on the teams themselves, gain enough expertise to do that, like you have to have something. It's not enough to be multidisciplinary, like to bring in 5 people with 5 different expertises. You really have to be interdisciplinary. Like they have to communicate and talk to each other and translate their own perspectives into ones that the other people in their teams will understand. Really hard, but yeah, vitally important.
Really, really, really necessary. And today we don't have much time, but I still want to make sure that we get to the random question that we make every once in a while. It comes from the audience, all right? So this is not a question I made up. It comes from somebody who was curious about this. And this one today was clicking while you were finishing your final sentence, and I thought it would be very interesting, especially to ask today, given our chat. This person asks a very simple question. He or she says, what would you say is something that gamification is very bad at achieving?
Ooh. That is an interesting question. Ooh, so it's a complicated question too, because gamification as a design process, I think means that it's very flexible. You can use it to accomplish a lot of things if designed well. I think what it's not good at doing then is fundamentally changing the underlying thing that you're trying to help. So that's a weird way of saying, say for example, that you're talking about like something like in education, you have like a lecture, right? So say you have a lecture and there's a little bit of, maybe you do your standard kind of active learning stuff. There's a little group work, a little bit of interaction. And you say, man, I just don't think people are engaging with this really well. Maybe the content is not really meshing. I'm going to gamify. So whatever you do to that lecture, if the lecture is not fundamentally delivering the right information based on the needs of the course or the needs of your learners, gamification will never fix that problem. It's something that we've proposed formally in some of our work on gamification of learning, this idea that if you don't start at least with the nugget of something good, no amount of gamifying is ever going to fix that problem. You might make it a little more fun. You might make it a little more interesting. But if your goal is, in this example, if your goal is for people to learn, like if you're not fundamentally delivering the information that they need to know, if it's not in an organizational context, if it's not ultimately tied with organizational goals, if it's not really going to help anybody do their job better, like regardless of how well you deliver that information and how effectively it helps people, get excited, you're never going to get there. It still, at the end of the day, requires that the fundamental thing you're gamifying has the potential to be good. And no number of game elements will ever solve that problem if it's not.
I've heard before the expression if a process is broken, you don't fix the process by introducing gamification. Maybe you help some of the steps get done and people be engaged and interested in doing those steps, but you have to change the process itself. The process is broken. Fix the process.
Yeah, and it happens in the hiring process too. There's organizations, and I'm sure most people that have worked in entry level jobs have experienced this horribleness where you apply for a job, and even if they like you, you don't hear back for like 2 or 3 weeks, and then after 2 or 3 weeks, you're like, oh, you got an interview. It'll be in 2 more weeks, and then 2 more weeks you get an interview, and you go to the interview, you hear nothing. For another 3 weeks, you do, we actually do want you for a second interview. Can you do that? Great. And then they come back for the second interview, and then you find out you have the job eventually like 2 or 3 months after you've applied. And so people with that kind of process have come to me and said, we want to gamify because people hate our application process. And I'm like, well, there's some more fundamental problems with that application process. That gamifying is not like giving somebody a progress bar is not going to make them feel all that much better about your 3-month delay. Like the 3-month delay is the problem. That's what you need to fix. And that's hard. It's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of folks. Like they don't want to admit in many cases that fundamentally what they're doing is broken, that it's not just dressing up what they have. It's changing what they have is what they need. It's a place that IO psychologists find themselves often in when somebody comes with, say, oh, we're having this problem. And then you go and you're like, I think you're having a different problem and maybe a bigger problem than you think. So being able to see that, again, that's part of that taking a step back and saying, no matter how exciting we make what you've got isn't good. Like it's a hard line to cross, but one I think you have to be willing to cross to really make any real change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Richard, you've been dropping quite a few value bombs throughout the interview. Is there any final piece of advice you want to leave us with? Then please let us know where we can find you, where we can continue this chat and make you any, questions, interactions that we want to have, social media, wherever you want. And then we'll say it's game over.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I am on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to get to me, at RN, as in Nathan Landers. I'm also via email for those that still use email, rlanders@umn.edu. And those are probably the fastest ways. Twitter is probably a little faster, as odd as that is to say out loud. So if any questions at all or any curiosity about this kind of thing, I talk to startups, I talk to more established organizations too, really struggling with how to find real value in an organization related to their HR processes using games and gamification. And always happy to chat on it.
Super, super interesting. So thank you again very much. I know you had a crazy week. Time's always super precious in these kinds of environments. So thank you very much for spending this time with us. However, now it's time to say that it's game over. Hey, Engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. And I hope you enjoyed this interview with Dr. Richard Landers. And do you have questions that you would like to ask to other guests? Then go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it is selected, it will come up in a future episode and you'll get your answer live. And before you go into your next mission, would you like to know what we can learn from tech, music, design, and many other disciplines for gamification? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.